Hey, it's been a bit, so I wanted to give a bit of an update, as today marks the second month since the launch of the channel, and within the past few days, it's also crossed the 200 subscriber threshold, which is pretty neat. Suffice to say, things have definitely only gotten more interesting as the year has progressed, both in terms of my virtual event production efforts, and as also the world more broadly. The initial batch of videos has been directly responsible for being contacted by multiple startups interested in licensing much of my work, both some of the newer lighting development as well as the longer running video development, and as such I've had lots to figure out over the past couple of months while in the background figuring out the next steps both with the channel and with other client work. That's been a gradual process, but I've gradually ultimately got it pretty well figured out now. So I've been working on a number of things, but here's some brief examples of what I've been up to. Firstly, I've been doing a fair amount of work tweaking the sample fixtures to play nicely with volumetric lighting, as you can see here. Secondly, thanks to Patrick at Epic Games for showing me a preview of a utility he was working on, which they should be releasing on GitHub shortly, and which I referenced as a template to build my own version, and that's an editor panel to bulk patch fixtures by bulk selecting a group of them in the viewport, and then specifying the starting patch entry, and then it just rips right through them all. And you can see that in the right of the editor. I'd not previously had a need to mess with custom editor panels, but it's actually pretty easy, and you can extend this quite substantially in the future, like with MVR support or any number of things. Thirdly, quite a lot of my time has gone towards exploring how deeply I can take show file programming in .2, and it actually turns out to be quite a bit more powerful than the simplistic interface might initially let on. So I'm gradually working towards a rather fully featured template show file to use for virtual and physical lighting rigs alike, as well as setting it up to fairly deeply control my Resolume rig as well. Fourthly, not shown in this particular Unreal scene, I've also got remote NDI feeds from both Resolume and Remote Performers set up using the latest NDI SDK versions. Fifthly, aside from figuring out some of the client work stuff, which is largely figured out now, I've also been planning the next steps for my work on lighting tools more broadly, as well as the next steps for the channel along with it. So the biggest component of that is, of course, working on the Unreal DMX fixture library on GitHub to get it into a usable spot. I've done some experimentation so far, and I've reached the conclusion that I'll want to create a parent fixture class of my own on which to base custom fixtures in order to make it easier to do so. I've determined the GLP FR1 RGBW LED beam is a good candidate to start with as a drop-in replacement for the Sharpie, which adds RGBW color mixing support. As such, I've been looking at existing 3D models that already exist for the purpose, but I've determined they're really only helpful as reference. It'd just take way too long to clean up these CAD files that are comprised of hundreds of small meshes, each with its own awful mesh topology. And these models also omit key pieces such as most of the optics, which is fine for a beam, but a mess for some of the other models like bands that I've looked at. As such, I've determined the most efficient way of working is to simply gather as many references as possible and create brand new models from scratch based on whatever level of detail I determine is needed to accurately replicate the features I want out of the fixture. That said, this is all quite a lot of work. So I'll start small with finishing up the Model 4 and then coding the FR1 without relying on a parent class for the lighting behavior. And then from there, I can gradually start refactoring that out into a more modular parent class, and which I've already written some notes down of how I think it can be improved. From there, I can also potentially look at doing some other fixtures. Of course, initially, I had a feeling this was going to be a lot of work. But it's still turning out to be quite a bit more work than I initially thought even, and as such, while I'd like to have the resources freely available to the community, as in the fixture library, that's also a time investment that I can't fully justify on its face, so I've been looking for a compromise. More on that later. While I've got some startups that I'm working with to license various virtual event production IP of mine, that's still pretty slow going, and being startups, they don't have a lot of cash on hand for upfront development. And seeing as in-person AV work still isn't properly coming back for easily another 2 months, or possibly quite a while longer, and also seeing as disability keeps me from going out and doing just any type of work, I've reached the conclusion that the best course of action for the time being is to put together Patreon now that the YouTube channel has a bit of momentum. So I've gone ahead and done that, and there's a link in the description. this is a bit of a trial run and a chance for me to gauge interest. But if the community can collectively help fund development, then there isn't strictly a need to make it inaccessible, as in putting the DMX library behind a paywall. So what I've come up with is a $3 tip jar tier for patron updates and access to a new patron Discord server, a $10 tier that adds Patreon messaging on that platform to ask me questions, which I'll try to stay on top of about weekly. YouTube is probably going to take a bit longer now, as you may or may not have noticed, as the channel has expanded. And then that tier will also have Patreon polls to help influence both development work as well as the future of video content. So I can, get your feedback and you can have a say. The $20 tier adds access to a private Git repo where I'm moving the active library development to. So the game plan is roughly at the start of each month, or next week in the case of this July, doing a 2-week sprint on lighting development, working inside of that repo with Patreon updates at the end of each of those weeks, and then doing a 2-week sprint after that, those 2 weeks of another 2 weeks of client work. And then at the end of that period, or the end of the month, the plan is to sync the private repo to the public repo on GitHub, and then basically start the whole process all over again. To be clear, I'd still want to be open to pull requests on the public repo if people want to contribute to it. And it'd be nice to eventually hire on other devs in the future, but that's a consideration for another time. There's also a couple sponsor tiers that add sponsor Discord channels and monthly one-on-one Discord calls with me if anyone feels particularly enthusiastic. So that's mainly all I have for you today. As I said, the Patreon page is live and linked in the description. I tried to come up with rewards that would both provide value to the community for the purposes of hopefully funding development without also being too disruptive both to accessibility or to development itself, which is a challenge that any other developers in the audience can attest to is a pretty significant challenge. Also, to provide a bit of context, the initial videos were a solid 3 to 4 weeks of R&D, going from R&D to published videos in order to make the tutorials. So any future tutorials are fairly non-trivial. So what I may do to tackle this in the future is do some Patreon polls that propose substituting some of the monthly development sprints for tutorial sprints instead. At some point, I'd also like to maybe start putting together some recorded light shows and eventually bring more VJ content to the channel. I'm also considering maybe doing some live streams, which could be educational or maybe development focused, as long as I'm not coding anything too demanding, or possibly doing some streamed light shows, either with pre-recorded or live DJ sets from some DJ friends of mine, or any DJs that you can that you might suggest. So if that's stuff you want to see, consider throwing my Twitch at LexiVFX a follow, and let me know the type of stream content you might want to see in the form of the content. And just to now that I've got some more clarity on client work, I'd like to jump more consistently into development and also be more active on YouTube. But I'll also have to see how the month evolves in terms of reception to see how much time I can responsibly push towards community lighting development, but I'm hopeful this will be viable. Likewise, let me know your thoughts about the channel and lighting development moving forward in the comments, and hopefully we can build Unreal towards an awesome lighting tool together. Have a nice evening. Good night.